so we can kind of cover some of this third principle and be able to because some of the questions you asked may be covered by that. So, but if you're in desolation or consolation, what does Ignatius have advice for? You might think, well, if I'm in consolation, what do I need any advice for? But that's precisely the point. You'll notice he only has two bullet marks under that. So let's look at consolation first. If you're in consolation, he says you need to do two things. This is page 13, near the bottom. If one is experiencing consolation, then number one should, quote, consider how he conduct himself during the time of ensuing desolation to defend and resist against it. Ignatius is real. He's like, you're not going to be in consolation forever, no matter how good you are. Desolation is coming. So now, knowing that that's a fact, and now that you're in a place of peace and quiet and, closer to God, now's the time to prepare. What am I going to do when it hits me? So it's not such a blind side next time, maybe, and you recover a little quicker. The second one, he says, and one should, quote, take care to humble himself as much as possible so you don't fall into pride. Especially if the consolation starts to last a little long, and you're like, God really likes me. Right? And that becomes, God really likes me a little more than these people. And then it may turn into it's not even God, it's me. Right? I have all these virtues, I'm just kind of holding myself by this great thing. And so he has these warnings, they're both kind of warnings. He's, I'll enjoy the consolation, but really think what's going to happen when it's gone. How are you going to react? And two, while it's going on, don't let it sort of slide you in the wrong direction. Now for desolation, he has 4 different things, he says. The first thing he makes has to do with discernment specifically and decision making. And he says, one should, quote, never make any change, but remain firm and constant in our resolution and decisions. Do not make decisions hastily simply because of sadness or aridity. Right? You're in desolation, you're anxious, you're restless, you're like, I have to decide now. Ignatius says, no, you absolutely can't now. Because you're not coming from the place of rationality and real reflection. You're coming out of desperation and fear. Don't make the decision. Keep doing everything you're doing without change until desolation ends. This is not the time for major life decisions. Right? Nothing. Never mind. I don't know if we all do. I have weird thoughts that run through my head all the time. I was going to make a joke about so you're sitting there going, I think I'm going to bring the mullet back. No, you're not going to do it, right? Don't do it. Anyway. If you don't know a mullet, that's good. Don't worry about it. But remember Billy Ray Cyrus, and you got it. So, what else should you do? Number 2, one should intensify our activity against the desolation by turning more assiduously to prayer, meditation, examination, conscience, and penances. So if I'm feeling low, Ignatius says, well, now start to do the externals and those practices that might reinvigorate you. Right? Don't give up your prayer because you're not feeling into it. Don't now stop going to Mass as frequently as you were. Don't not go to confession. Do those more than ever. Now's the time to really put your whole effort into it and fight against this kind of feeling you're having. Now's the time to really start practicing the faith. Number 3, one should remember that any desolation can be overcome, quote, with the help of God, which always remains, though he may not clearly perceive it. And so Ignatius reminds us, yes, you're in a slump. You're in desolation right now. But just because you feel God is absent, your faith tells you he's not. He's still there. He's still there to answer. He's still there to provide you with the grace you need. In other words, as Paul says, no matter what the trial, God will give you the grace to see it through. That's what Ignatius is reminding us. Yeah, you feel bad, but don't let that translate into really thinking, in fact, that God has abandoned you, because he doesn't do that. God is still there. And so this is the time to continue to, remember and reflect using your faith and ask God for the help to overcome this. And then number 4, one should, quote, strive to persevere in patience to gain peace against the disquiet that is assailing them and remind them that consolation will return in time. Just like in consolation, you know desolation will be coming. So also don't let yourself get into that depressed state because of desolation and just think, well, this is how it's going to be. No, he says, remind yourself, consolation it will be returning. And in the meantime, what you need to do is whatever works for you to let yourself sort of begin to get into that calm, lack of anxiety, like whatever helps you sort of reduce that fear so you can gain peace and then recall these things. So basically in desolation, you don't make any major life changes. You really intensify your practice of faith. You remember by faith, not feelings, that God is always there and always responding for your good. So ask him for the grace and continue to pray and everything. And for persevere, knowing that this too will pass. And so that's the advice he gives people in desolation and consolation. We'll just look a little bit into principle 3 because it may kind of answer some questions people already have that we haven't touched on yet. So principle 3 now. The good and evil spirits adapt themselves to the persons whom they are trying to influence. Well, I already mentioned that at the beginning with the little square box, but let's see what Ignatius says a little more concretely. So on page 14, the first big paragraph, this is the good spirit to the good person. Here's what he actually sort of says in here. First, the good spirit adapts himself to a good person by seeking every means and opportunity to, quote, give courage and strength, consolation, tears, inspirations, and peace, by making everything easy, by removing all obstacles, so that the soul may go forward in doing good. It's important to understand that St. Ignatius defines a good person as one who goes on, quote, earnestly striving to cleanse their souls from sin and who seeks to rise in the service of God to greater perfection. That's why I said his definition of a good person is not a lot of people, to be honest. And later he'll talk about the mediocres. That's most of us. So this is a person, this is a person whose life is devoted to really becoming more holy. Not just going to Mass regularly, as good as that is. This is a person who's seeking to progress. That's their focus in life. And so that type of person, he says, notice the person not necessarily living in the state of perfection, they still sin on occasion. On occasion. And probably not mortally at this point anymore. So, in other words, what he's doing is, I don't know how many of you have read Dark Night of the Soul and The Ascent of Mount Carmel. The way John defines a beginner isn't any of us. Almost, it's a person who's already overcome all these sins, who's detached from all this, who does this. Now you're a beginner in this way of life. So in the same way, Ignatius kind of points out a very difficult one at this point. Although God always tests those he loves with trials, the crosses of life are always accompanied by the gift of his peace, so as to make the suffering bearable and even sweet at times. So we'll see what he says about people who aren't quite that level, but are faithful. Well, what about when the good spirit works upon a sinner? And who does Ignatius define a sinner? Again, his definition is kind of one extreme. So he has one extreme for goodness, a person of real virtue. And his definition of a sinner is really a person of mortal sin. He says a sinner is, quote, those who go from one mortal sin to another, or simply always from bad to worse. So what does God do on such a person? Well, when the good spirit interacts with that person, God adapts himself to the person's pressing need, which is salvation, and the life of grace itself. In such a case, the good spirit seeks to deter someone and discourage them from their vices by drastic shocks and warnings, in order to, quote, arouse the sting of conscience and fill them with remorse. He tells us what he does. The good spirit fills the sinner with worry and anxiety over his past life, lets them experience pain and suffering directly related to their sins, imparts a direct fear of death and eternal punishment, so as to break them out of their complacency and bring them back to God. So, even though it's God, quote, it doesn't feel pleasant in any way, shape, or form. when he's dealing with someone in mortal sin. Simply because the person lacks the enough state of grace to really experience that part of God that well. Now, going to the other side now. What about the evil spirit when he acts with a person who is already a sinner? That evil person defined above. So now evil on evil. Or, and this is a big or that Ignatius gives us, or one who is not really serious about following God. So the devil has the same power over a person who's kind of nonchalant and not whatever, as he is with a serious sinner. Well, how does the evil spirit work on him? He, quote, fills their imagination with sensual delights and gratifications, the more readily to keep them in their vices and increase the number of their sins. Right? He wants to deaden their conscience more and more and more. So they don't even raise up for a moment a flag when they're doing things and think, this might be wrong. This might not be good for me. This might be something evil over time. Now, it's only in the fourth one where he finally separates good people from others. He says, when the evil spirit tries to influence a good person, he must be much more cunning. And then Ignatius says there are two types of good people. So you could say that he kind of does this to his on one side are the people he's already named as good. Those are the way living in the way of perfection, greater or lesser. So it's number two. Or those who are moderately faithful in the practice of virtue. Now I won't make any judgment statements, but I'd say that's most of us. Most of us. We're moderately faithful. We try not to sin, especially mortally. We probably are a little lazier about venial sins or excuse about them and other things. So that's where we are. So what does Ignatius say then? With those who are moderately faithful, the evil spirit's primary means of attack is to create difficulties in their service of God by, quote, by seeking to, quote, harass them with anxiety, afflict them with sadness, and raise obstacles backed by fallacious reasoning to disturb their souls, to keep them from advancing. And St. Ignatius, his second sort of example, he's already compared the devil to a secret lover. Now he's going to compare the devil to a commander of an army who is constantly exploring the enemy's defenses and then hurls all of his attacks at that most vulnerable point. And this is what he says at the top of page 15. Quote, the enemy of our human nature investigates from every side all our virtues, theological, cardinal, and moral. Where he finds the defenses of salvation the weakest and most effective, he attacks there and tries to take us quickly by force. So, for those of us in moderate spirituality, he just spends time watching, right? He spends time watching. And he knows, where does your failure lie? Is it in faith? Do you have a lot of doubts that constantly assail you in your struggle with faith? Is it in charity? You're really difficult in loving others and really treating people, loving them as you love yourself. Where is your weakness? And then he will hit it as many times as he can quickly. So you step outside and you run into somebody and they say something and it starts to stir it. And you get in your car and you turn on the radio and the radio mentions something about it. And you're just hit right in that place, one after another, where you're going to fall. Now, in this case, Ignatius says this is one time where the devil acts out of character, where he is mostly quiet, secretive, because he hopes to overtake you quickly by repeated assaults on that weakness. He sort of shows himself. Boom, boom, boom. So basically, Ignatius says, in doing so, he always causes havoc, confusion. And so a person seeking to be faithful to God can easily recognize him if he's open to the sign. Right? It's not by accident that you're getting hit in your weak spot 10, 15 times in a period of 2 or 3 days. But if anything, that should clue you in, oh, this is why. This is why. And then now he is in the light. And then Ignatius says, and once that's acknowledged, he's gone. he flees. He tried to do it, and it didn't work, so he moves on. But what he's trying to do is just slow us down, if nothing else. Right? Remember, what makes the devil happy is always us being less spiritual. If he can't get you to sin, he'll at least get you to not do as much that's good. If that's all he can get out of you, he's fine with that. So if he can tell you, don't do this thing, and convince you, no, I'll do this one that's a little easier, this and that. He knows this one's a far more important thing of grace for you and what God would really want you to do. So if he can convince you to do something else that's good but lesser, he's still won. Because you've lost all the grace God desired to give you and gotten this lesser amount. So you're proceeding slower. And as long as you're proceeding slowly, he can continue to tell you how long the road is, how difficult this is. Do you really think that there's anything after death that's worth all this, right? That's the, quote, fallacious reasoning. You've seen that phrase that Ignatius uses several times, right? He'll get in your mind and start to ask you, is it worth all the rules? Is it worth all the things? The garden. God say you really can't eat any of these trees? None of them? And she's like, oh, no, we can eat the other ones. But then, right, the thought is planted. Well, what did he say? Now I'm not so sure. And what does that mean? And what did you say about death a minute ago? Right? It's all this kind of stuff to slow us down or stop us from moving forward. Now, when he's dealing with someone who's on the path of perfection, someone who's really attained a high spiritual maturity level, he can't use that one because the person won't fall for it. We might fall for it. We're hit a few times and we're like too caught up in it and not really reflecting, what does this mean? Is this like a desolation? We might give in, right? We fall into the temptation. He has us, at least for a moment. Now, for a person who's more spiritually mature, he can't do that. So how does he work with them? Well, he seeks to stimulate within the person the spiritual joys given by the good spirit in order to lead them astray. Right? He appears, as Paul says, like the angel of light. So look, this person's already holy. They already experienced consolation from God. So why don't I give them some visions? And the visions will be holy ones with just one little off part that they probably won't notice. And then I'll give them more to follow that up. And then I'll give them this. And slowly but slowly, I'll turn them more and more, piece by piece, in this direction. And so he says, quote, he assumes the appearance of the angel of light, suggesting thoughts that are suited to a devout soul, and ends by suggesting his own. He will endeavor little by little to end by drawing the soul into his hidden snares and designs. Unlike the direct attack method, which is easily recognized due to the disturbance it creates in the soul, the subtle method of pious thoughts and false consolations takes more time and effort to identify. Generally speaking, when the course of one's thoughts suggested concludes in something evil or distracting, or seeks for us to do less good than we had formerly done or proposed to do, or when it ends up weakening or destroying our peace and tranquility of soul, then no matter how holy or spiritual the thoughts may be, they are to be suspected as coming from the evil spirit and not followed. If you thought only God could put nice thoughts in your head, you're naive, Ignatius says. He can appear as an angel of light. He can give us nice thoughts. He can see us kneeling in front of a statue and say, I'm going to give that person pleasure at this, and they're going to attribute it to God. Let's start there. Real simple. And so you pray and you're like, oh, God's consoling me. But if you're really clued in, you realize, I don't really feel like I'm growing in faith, hope, or love. I just have a nice feeling. But sometimes we're not. We're so caught up, we're like, oh. And so it can be very subtle. And then he leads us a little more each direction. Notice, like I mentioned, it's good enough for him if he can just get us to do less good. I think I told you, Ignatius, one of his own experiences when this first happened, is Ignatius, at a certain point after his conversion, and he had already begun the Jesuits, but he was not educated theologically. I mean, he was a smart man. You can tell that the exercises he wrote before he was a priest or anything. But he didn't have formal theological education. And so knowing what his mission was for the church, and especially the reclamation of Europe from Protestantism, he better know the faith. So he determined to see these teachers and become in the faith. Within the day he was meant to start it, he took a long sabbatical from his brothers to go do this. And he talks about the fact that starting on the first day, he got his books out to start studying. He said he was given the most exalted visions and feelings. They would just keep him in trance for hours. And he would sit there thinking, wow, look at all these wonderful things God is doing for me. And it took him a week and a half to realize that in a week and a half he had done nothing to study. Never once did they suggest, the devil in this case did not suggest anything for him to do. It didn't try to make him more holy in that sense. It simply kept him captivated from not doing what the devil knew would be of more importance overall. And so Ignatius firsthand experiences the fact, can the devil send good thoughts, holy thoughts? You bet he can. You bet he can. Pleasurable, enjoyable, and yet there's something about them because once you look back on them or you start to reflect, they're not really making you into a better person. God's action always does that to some extent. It always fills you with more faith or more hope or more charity or gets you to go on. It doesn't simply appear, like Jesus. He didn't do miracles so people could be impressed. He had a reason for every miracle he did. And he critiques people a lot who came just for the miracle, for its own sake, right? You believe because you got fed. But that's not what I care about, right? That's what he's trying to tell them. Why are the crowds following? For what Jesus would do miraculously on their physical bodies. And then he'd preach, and only a much smaller number would have that part of it. And that's Jesus himself. He is God doing good things. But now certainly the devil can do, quote, good things, can lead us astray, can seem like it's something holy when in fact it's not. And I've mentioned cases before. Saint Ursula, who's a canonized saint, but during her canonization process, it was discovered that there was a period of about 2 years where she held seances. That's what we call it today. Of a saint who was speaking to her, one of the deceased sisters. They took the bones out of the cemetery and everything. This is for a long period of time. This is a canonized, faithful saint. Until she finally got the clue, this probably isn't God. Or that sister deceased talking to me. Right? So even the holiest people can make mistakes sometimes. And out of their desire to do good, out of just a moment's weakness or laziness, they get hooked, and if they're not careful, it can take them down. Most people at that level, they're not going to go to the point of losing their salvation, but it may have detoured them for a long time to get back. So it's always important to really reflect. The thing that I would say, kind of how I put it in my own words, is this. What is important in Ignatian discernment is not the feelings accompanying anything, but the goal in which it's pointing you towards. In other words, if I can see these things are leading me to a deeper faith, or to be kinder to this person, or to have a deeper love for God, then that's what I go by, not whether I feel good or bad about it. That's not consolation and desolation. But if I have all these pleasurable things, but I'm looking down the end and I see and I get, we're smart. That's why we have brains. God gives us the brain. Look at what this is leading to as its final cause. And if that final cause doesn't seem to be doing those things, then no matter how good it feels, how nice it is, it's probably not God. It's probably not God. So let it go. Let it go. And that's a difficult one for us because, by nature and because of the nature of God himself and our fallen existence, all of us, anyone who's spiritual, I don't think there's anyone spiritual who doesn't want to feel God. Who doesn't want to feel in some way. I want to experience God, not just by faith, but I want to have some kind of, thing I feel. And while that does and can happen, Ignatius reminds us, be careful of that, though. Because there's so many things that can counterfeit that and draw on that almost obsessive need that I want to know, right? I want to know God loves me. I want to know what he feels like. I want to be sure he exists. And that's why John of the Cross, for his, will say, not unto everything. No, not that, not that, not that. Just faith. Just faith. Only the faith will carry you onwards and not the feelings or anything else. And so that's what you need to. And then once you're fixed in faith, if God gives you consolations and locutions and revelations and all these other things, great. You experience them, they're gone, and you move forward. Instead of getting hooked on them, even if they're good, distracted, and move to the side, right? And mistake kind of the little crumb along the way for what you're heading towards at the end. Now, we'll go too far in that because that's getting us way beyond basic discernment. But you start to see where this leads. Now, I want to mention the last thing, and then we'll have questions. The last thing on this part that Ignatius mentions is the third category, the company that encompasses many people, but has aspects of the other two categories. What about those of us who are faithful to the precepts of God in general, but quite careless in our spiritual life, and so often fall into venial and sometimes more serious sin? Right? That probably describes a lot of practicing Catholics and other Christians. What about them? Well, they're clearly not as bad as a sinner who goes from mortal sin to mortal sin. Yet at the same time, they're clearly not good enough to be, quote, earnestly rooting out his sins and advancing daily from good to better. So what about these middle people who kind of have a foot in each camp? Ignatius's rules are pretty simple here, actually. He says the general principles governing the good spirit and evil spirit remain the same for a person who's lax and mediocre. In other words, God feels to you like he feels to the sinner. Not maybe as intensely, but that's how he interacts with you. And that's how the devil interacts with you. Because you still are not in a consistent enough conscious state of grace for him to be able to act differently towards you. Ignatius has a term for these people. He calls them tepid. And he says they're acted upon comparatively the same way as the spirits act upon a person who is a sinner. So the evil spirit seeks to inspire false security and comfort in us in our evil, and the good spirit seeks to rouse us from the torpor and do more and more good works. The final thing I'll mention is this, and then questions. Kind of skip the quote from Father Hardin at this point. One final aspect. In order to have any ability whatsoever to discern spirits, one must have some notion of their basic spiritual condition. You have to have some idea. If you have no interior life, you can't discern. Because you have no idea. You have nothing to gauge it by, nothing to look at. So most of us, though, especially if you're kind of Bible study, if you're going to church regularly, you have some idea of your spiritual life. You know if you attend Mass regularly, you know if you pray regularly, and you know if you don't do those things, or you know if you have little things that are constantly cropping up and tripping you up. So we have to kind of know our own spiritual condition. He says, including their overall fidelity to God and his commandments, their response to divine grace, and the areas that one has the most negligence in regarding their commitment to the Lord. Discernment becomes increasingly more difficult the less faithful a person has been to the teachings of the church, the dictates of conscience, and the inspiration of grace, since the person has obscured the very norms that guide all discernment and spiritual progress. Conversely, the greater one's fidelity to church teaching, the greater one's moral actions, and the more surrendered one is to God's inspiration, the increasingly greater their ability to detect the evil spirit will be, and they will now allow it to hinder their normal disposition to do good and avoid sin, as well as being able to recognize the good spirit that is encouraging them in their habitual intention to please God. So, one of the things, and what this will lead to in Ignatian spirituality, and I'll hand it out now, but I may not talk about it until next time. But one of the things that really Ignatius creates, for hundreds of years before him, there had been the examination of conscience. But Ignatius will be really the first, to my mind, to take that and really give it a twist that makes it a much more powerful tool, which he calls the examen. And so I'll pass out that prayer, and this is a way that Ignatius would say that daily we can begin to really gauge our spiritual life, to see where we are, but also in the practice of it to really get to the place of awareness that God is present in everything all around us, in all the events, all the people, everything that God is present. And so it begins to increase our faith. It's not just like an examination of conscience where I'm just looking where I did bad. The examine is more so looking at where was God each day in my life. And as I look back in hindsight each day and reflect on it, more and more I become the awareness of how God really is present, which increases my faith and changes this whole sort of dynamic of my life. So if we have time, depending on the questions, we'll look at that today. If not, we'll look at it next time. But for the moment then, let's go ahead and just pause and take time for questions at this point and comments and such. Anybody? Yes.
Going back to page 11, there's a sentence here that perhaps like a little bit additional clarification. Towards the top of the page, the interaction between the spirit and the human person will differ between the degree of sanctity that has been achieved by the person throughout their cooperation with divine grace.
Right.
Cooperation with divine grace. Talk a little bit about what's inferred there.
Well, every moment, growing closer in sanctity, which is really just growing closer in faith, hope, and love, it's becoming more like Christ. As we develop a more intimate relationship with Jesus, as we become more surrendered to God the Father, as we allow the Spirit to guide us, all those things are cooperating with grace, because it's through grace, God's own power and life, by which He's raising us to this more and more this supernatural level. The gifts that began in baptism they are planted in us start to become more enlivened, you could say, start to become more active. They begin to become more dominant traits, if you will, of how we live our lives. So it all has to do with my cooperation with grace. Cooperation with grace can be as mundane as following the commandments of the Lord to following an inspiration that the Lord put someone in my life that I just really have a feeling I need to sort of do something for and help them out. It's any of those ways in which we're trying to move forward to glorify God and to grow in our own spiritual life. Yeah.
Chris, in this part of discernment, how have the people that have been very successful dealt with the people around them? Because it seems like you're trying to do your best, and then other people come around and they go, "Yeah, you're really doing great. You're really, we want to expand that." How does that person that is in their own journey, how do they deal with the people around them that want to lift them up and to and to kind of glorify what they're doing as being something special?
Yeah, and
Pride.
right. Yeah, you have to. I mean, I think the main thing is you just have to keep yourself humble in different ways. For each one of us, it can be different. If you're kind of if you're really manly, like Francis of Assisi, you could make sure to tell everyone your worst faults whenever they try to say how impressive you are. But that's awkward for most of us, right? But
well, how do you do it in your life? Because obviously you're in an elevated, esteemed position. How do you deal with it in regular life?
You smile and say thank you, and then move on. A lot of times, thank you. And what did you have to say, Quinn?
Nothing. I'll let you know how he doesn't.
You don't say out to my wife.
Well, yeah, that too. You usually have people in your life who will humble you as well, like my 3 daughters and stuff. So that's, yeah. I mean, a lot of times that can manifest in a lot of ways. If they see that you're growing in spirituality and they like it, you may get asked to do more things. And so, like always, you have to start discerning these things. Can I really do that or not? And then you're just gracious about it. If you really come to the idea, I can't do this, I can't come do this talk, or I can't join this ministry right now, be gracious and move on. If you get the feeling, though, discern it, and maybe God is using them as a way to kind of move you into specific concrete action, and you would do that as well. But what you have to try to do is still remain that detachment from all things. And remember, what Ignatius said, everything in life is going to do 1 of 4 things. Either you're going to do it correctly and use it as you should, you're going to have to get rid of it if you find it's hindering you, or you might have to endure it, and that might be the case sometimes. Sometimes you have to endure your holiness popularity, even though it's difficult. A lot of the saints have had to do that. There's a great story of Brother Juniper, who was one of the first Franciscans. And he was the one, I think I told the story, like even Francis got mad at him because everywhere he went, if he saw someone homeless, he'd give them his clothes, and then he'd walk around either naked or with a loincloth. And after about 4 times, Francis probably doesn't do good for the order to see you walk around naked, with a loincloth. So he tells Brother Juniper, he says, I forbid you under penalty of sin and obedience, I forbid you to give your tunic away. So he says, okay. The very day he's out in public and he sees a man shivering. And so he says to the man, I can't give you this tunic, but if you want to take it from me, I'll let you. Sure enough, he comes back shivering in the cold, himself naked. And at that point, Francis just kind of went, okay, whatever. But there's a great story told of him that just his gentle simplicity and this childlike innocence. And so as he's approaching one day one of the towns, and someone spots him in the field. And he's kind of a celebrity, right? So they run to the town, and as he's walking, he's still about half a mile away. They start ringing the bells and everything. And he realizes it's getting closer. But there's like a bunch of people. The mayor and everything is standing there, and he's thinking, oh God, this is for me. Like, they're coming out to see me. So as he gets within range of the city walls, he notices a group of children playing seesaw. So he goes over and he asks them to play, and they say, okay. So he's playing, and for a while the people in the town are like, oh, look how cute, right? He's playing seesaw. For like an hour and 40 minutes. He did it until the crowd dispersed. And only once they were gone, where they were certain this guy was not a saint but an idiot, then he went into town and said, now I can enter. So, a lot of the saints have dealt with that. Padre Pio had so many rosaries and stuff stolen, the guy couldn't walk anywhere. He chased one person down once, right? With his rosary back. So sometimes it's things we have to endure, and sometimes it's things we have to surrender. So part of it is that discernment of that. Is this something I have to surrender? Because it could be I have to surrender because I don't want to do these things, but it looks like God is sort of moving me in this direction, so I just surrender what I want to do, and I'll sort of do this to help whatever else needs me. Sometimes it's enduring it. Sometimes it's deciding I really can't do that. Because if you start to see pride come out, or you start to feel your own hype, then immediately it's time to get out and start doing what you need to do to kind of return to that more humble place. Yeah.
Good recommendation for a book for John on the Cross.
John of the Cross, a book. I would recommend it's about him with a lot of quotes, but it's Fire Within by Dubé, Father Dubé. It's probably one that's one of the best in terms of it's about Teresa of Avila as well. It's funny, some people read it and they said that was still a hard book, and I think really, but some don't. They think it's pretty well, but I think he does a good job trying to read John himself can be very hard. Dubé has a lot of long excerpts of John, but he also explains them. John's a mystic, and like I mentioned, John's letters, first of all, we also have to realize, you always have to realize who the context and the audience is. Like the Bible, Paul's letters are for us, right? He's just writing to average Christians out there. That's not who John's writing to. John is writing to men and women whose life has been spent for years studying and focusing and moving towards contemplation. So when John calls someone a beginner, he means a beginner in the life of contemplation, not a beginner like you and I down here. We're looking at what John says and you think, what is he even talking about? So that's why I hesitate to recommend him directly, and I would say Dubé has a good one. There's a website that you can check out too, ICS, the Institute for Carmelite Studies. They have a lot of books of varying, these are Carmelites that they put out their own book publishing company in the United States. And they have a lot of books of all different types about John that go anywhere from very basic, just about his life and very brief teachings, to detailed studies of him and such, as well as all of his own writings. They're the ones who put out all Teresa's writings and John's writings. Now, if you do want his writings, though, they're pretty affordable. You can get everything he ever wrote for roughly about $20 to $24 in one book, the complete writings of John on the Cross. But that's just my first thought is that one. Bonnie, do you think of anything? I know we have other Carmelites in here too who might be able to help with another book that helps.
I'm sorry. I liked reading his complete works when I was a baby person.
Yeah, I mean you can try them. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just.
Scott read them. Do you want to tell him what you thought?
I didn't think it was a hard read at all.
No.
I didn't think, I thought it was easy.
No.
Now,
Just
Father
read it carefully.
Dubé was a friend of mine, and I don't like fire weapons.
You know?
I threw it out. I found it. I have trouble because I have to. I don't know how to explain, but he's a good.
I know there's that
a good
2-volume one too, and I can't remember the author. The first one's I Want to See God, and the second volume is I'm the Daughter of the
that
Church.
Blessed Eugene.
Eugene.
Yes.
That's one too. He's much more detailed and much more.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas that you could think of any John Cross books that are in?
Allison Pearson's written good books about
Yeah.
him and
Allison Pierce. He's done a lot of the. They've done a lot of the translation too, at least original in English. That's just one I can think of. But other questions? Yes.
When we were talking about the 3 modes of discernment, I immediately was thinking about the rich man Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, you don't want to ask yourself, is this going to lead to me being like Lazarus in hell talking to God?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I'm through.
Yeah.
I found it enlightening about the secrecy thing that you said. It seems like people that do that, they're creating a fake reality so they can control everything. Isn't that kind of
That
what
could
it's like?
be, especially if the secrecy has to do with what they think. If it's secrecy over not confessing a sin, that's one type. But if it's secrecy over, I think I've gotten some privileged special information from God, and now I'm going to gather my little group around me who maybe think so too, without really consulting the larger church, without really going to spiritual authorities to sort of have this vetted, so to speak. Yeah, I create a little fake world of my own within that. And, it's always interesting because nowadays, and it's been like this in other periods of time as well, but I think with the explosion of social media and the internet and everything else, every Tom, Dick, or Harry has their little website and their group and this and that. And I'm a prophet and I have a healing and I'm an anointer and I do this. And, I think John's advice is always sobering because he lived at a time in Spain especially where that was at a fever pitch as well. But in the wake of the Protestant Reformation and kind of all the chaos that had created and Council of Trent going through, but still being in its infancy as these reforms, in Spain especially, there was tons of this upsurge of popular religiousness, so to speak. And there were visionaries and what we call them witch doctors today. I forget the term in Spanish. They're all over the place in Spain of John's time. And so it was kind of a reaction both to the church, which had reacted fortress mentality against Protestantism, but also against Protestantism, which made the faith so intellectualized. If you couldn't read, if you weren't literate, which meant you had to usually be a wealthier person and educated, then Protestants didn't want anything to do with you. Right? Luther wrote his early book, the Peasants' Rebellion, mocking the peasants who had basically followed what he said to do anyway. So you have these groups, the Alumbrados, and so John's advice, I think, it's still good today. It's very sobering. It's not what a lot of us want to hear, but he basically, to summarize him, he says, most of the people who think God is speaking to them are the ones who God most definitively is not speaking through. And the ones who are the most quiet and subtle and just kind of wise in their occasional statements to other people, he said those are the ones God is speaking to. And he made the same statement about prayer. He said a lot of people who think they're praying because they put on the show and they have all these things, he says their prayers don't reach heaven. He goes, and then the person who's struggling and can't get the right words out and don't know what they're doing, but they're praying from the heart, that person's praying. That's the real prayer. And so we have to be careful not to get caught up in all the showiness of stuff. Also, I always just ask myself, not that everything has to look exactly like Christ, because obviously as we mature in time, things change. But on the other hand, if there's no reason for something to look different, should it? What I mean by this is, think of Jesus' miracles. Jesus, we heal someone, he's all, okay, done. A few times, touch it. Once put mud on a guy's eyes. All very mellow. And then look at a lot of the people today. By the power of the Lord, and you're like, really? That itself you should just question. I'm not saying any of those people that they're all fakes, but you should ask yourself, why is their way so different from the Lord himself? He's mellow, he's quiet, he just slowly commands, he tells things, and they're like doing this and crazy things and sweating and asking for $1 million or God will kill them. Remember that with Oral Roberts?
Isn't that like Elijah with those false guys doing all that stuff?
Just weird, So anyway, remember next week there is no class because of the retreat. I hope you come. There's some handsome dude doing it, I heard. Like I told RCA last night, I forgot I had to teach last night RCA, so I had to write that whole thing up. I have a big thing, a reflection for our Franciscan group on Saturday. So the truth is, I really haven't started writing much for next week, so I hope it goes well. But either way, it'll be fun, right? Because the first night, even if it's a crap show, at least you'll be like, well, that was interesting to watch, right? I'm all over the place. So I'm going to try to make it good, but just pray for me and get my thoughts together and all this jumble. And then the next week we'll continue, and there should be that class. May end it. If not, we'll extend it one more to finish it. So we're almost done with this, with discernment either way. So let's go ahead in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We ask you to continue to encourage and sustain us in our practice of penance and generosity and prayer during this Lenten season, and just continue to open our hearts up more and more to your word. And as we make that word part of our lives, we will have the intelligent discernment to really have the spiritual sense of taste for what comes from you and what comes from something other than you. And then give us the courage to follow the words that you would have us follow, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Thanks, you guys.
That's right. Way to sell it.
What?
Way to sell it.
That's what I told him on RCIA too.